The world was falling apart. Fascist Nazi shock troops of the Third Reich and their blitzkrieg had spread across Europe and northern Africa and were marching their eastern front deep into the heart of Russia. The Empire of Japan was making its conquest of the Pacific reality. 65 million human lives would be lost. 11 million would eventually be systematically exterminated by an evil war machine like the world had never seen before. To gain a foothold into Europe and take on the armies of Hitler's Nazi Third Reich, the world needed a new elite type of soldier. The paratrooper was that soldier. Changing Hearts and Minds welcomes you to a special series dedicated to the greatest generation, and specifically, the well-known story that inspired the best-selling book and HBO miniseries, Band of Brothers. Join me, Jeff Adamick, veteran of the U.S. Army where I served as a paratrooper in the 82nd, Ranger in the 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, and finally as a Green Beret in 3rd Special Forces Group, as I welcome fellow veterans, other podcast hosts and personalities, and some very special guests to honor the true story, book, and television series about the greatest generation's most honored story of sacrifice, service, and leadership in the face of overwhelming evil. Lessons in Leadership, the men and history of Easy Company.
Skip Muck died, and Eugene Rowe came to me about 10 minutes after he was killed, and he wanted me to see if I wanted to go look at him, and I said no, I wouldn't be able to stand that, so I didn't go look at him.
After Bastogne, we went to Haguenau. There was another push there. We wanted to get some idea what was across the river there and what kind of strength they had.
You have a feeling you're going to live through the war. You have a feeling it's starting to ease off. You can't account for it. It's just a gut feeling, but everybody had that feeling. I believe I might be able to live through it. So walk carefully. Take care of yourself.
Welcome to this episode of Lessons in Leadership, Band of Brothers. This is a multi-part series on the legacy of Easy Company, the book Band of Brothers, and the HBO miniseries of the same name. In this episode, we're breaking down and discussing Episode 8, titled The Last Patrol. But before we get into the introductions of our guest and co-hosts and Episode 8 itself, let's quickly review the events from the last episode, The Breaking Point. In the last episode, the company is still stuck in Bastogne and is succumbing to the cold, harsh winter. The Ardennes forest and the heavy shelling the Germans are sending their way are taking their toll on the men of Easy Company, and we see the accident that leads to Private Hubler shooting and killing himself with his newly obtained German Luger. Bill Garnier and Joe Toy both lose legs and are sent home after being blown up during a shelling attack, and the sight of his friends all blown to bits finally takes its final cut into the already battle-worn Buck Compton's soul and gets him sent home also. Despite this, things are looking up. They are due to take the town of Foy and finally be done with the dreaded winter. There's just one problem: Lieutenant Norman Dyke. He's never around, is incompetent, and never knows what to do. With no real commander to lead them, First Sergeant Lipton must do everything he can to keep the company strong. But what will they do when the fateful day comes that Dyke leads them into battle? Well, Lieutenant Dyke fails, just as everyone knows he was going to uphold his duty and to lead the company into battle on the assault on Foy, getting even more Easy Company men killed or wounded, and becoming so overwhelmed and ineffective that despite the attempts by First Sergeant Lipton to get him moving, he can't even get up off the ground. Finally, Captain Winters relieves Dyke in place mid-assault and sends Lieutenant Spears to take command of Easy Company to successfully complete the attack on Foy and establishing a solid base of leadership for the men of Easy Company, who are now under the leadership team of Lieutenant Spears and First Sergeant Lipton. The episode concludes with Spears informing Lipton he's being promoted with a battlefield commission to second lieutenant. I want to welcome our co-host for this episode, my good friend and host of Headspace and Timing on the Change Your POV podcast network, Duane France. Duane, welcome to the show, buddy.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to this one because I had a problem with deciding what show I wanted you to come on. It seems fitting that with your background, I would bring you on for Carrington, because that's the show that deals with the mental aspects of being in combat, especially with the one soldier in that episode who has the hysterical blindness that kicks in. But you had established a little bit earlier on your desire to talk about Webster, which is one of the characters that is really prominent in this episode. And so I gave you the option to choose which one of the shows you wanted to do, and you chose this show. What was the thought process for you behind choosing this one over Carrington?
Well, it was the impact of the psychological aftermath of Bastogne. And that's one thing that Webster really chronicles pretty well. After Compton leaves and seeing what happened to everybody, and then it's really showing sort of the. I think this is what, February, and so it's like 2 or 3 months after they get out of Bastogne, maybe 2 months, and it's really showing how Bastogne is still sticking with them. And even though the episode really only covers 24, 36 hours or something, 2 days maybe, it really shows how the impact of that and just how the guys come in together.
I agree with you. I think it's only I think 24 hours might be even pushing it. I think they show up late in the afternoon on the one day, and the episode ends like the next day before the afternoon even comes around.
Well, I think you had the 2 nights because you had the night patrol, then you had and obviously we'll get into that later. So you had the 2 nights and then afternoon of the next day. So maybe over 72 hours.
Yeah, it's very short episode as far as like the time span that overtakes. So in this episode, we're going to character focus will be on the episode's point of view character. Reminder to those of you who don't know about these types of literary and Hollywood type phrases, but point of view character means the entire episode is seen through the point of view of a single character. So much like Bastogne was seen through the eyes of Doc Rowe and Breaking Point is seen through the eyes of First Sergeant Lipton, our character in this episode that's got the first person point of view is not one of the main characters in the show, really. The character focus for this episode is David Webster. And Duane, I'm going to go ahead and let you go ahead and give us a breakdown of who David Webster was as a character and as a real person.
So David Kenyon Webster was a little older because he had been to college before he got into the Airborne Infantry. He was born June 2nd in 1922. On the show, he's played by Eon Bailey. He was educated at the Taft School in Watertown, Connecticut. I don't know that, but it sounds pretty freaking, hoity-toity.
Yeah, it is hoity-toity.
Right?
That's why.
I was going to say
it's
a little bit. This is the kind of guy that's going to end up at Harvard if you go to the Taft School at Watertown, Connecticut.
Funny you should mention that.
Funny you should mention that. But he did. So he started out. He went to Harvard. And then he joined the paratroopers in 1942 before he finished his degree. So he actually didn't. And I think somewhere in the series they talk about this, that he didn't finish his degree before he came in. He stopped and enlisted. He chose not to take an officer's commission stateside, but volunteered to be infantry. He was at Toccoa, but he wasn't with Easy Company. He didn't connect with Easy Company until after the jump at D-Day. He began with Fox Company and requested to be transferred to Easy Company because that's where all the action was. He wrote a lot. That was sort of his thing. He was an observer, and again we'll get into that as we go into the episode. But a lot of his letters were the basis of Ambrose's book and some of the other stuff that he did. He referred to himself by his middle name Kenyon in his letters to the family. He was wounded. He was actually wounded in Market Garden. I think he was wounded a little bit before that in Overlord. Maybe he was wounded in Overlord, had a scratch, and then came back to Easy and was put out of commission during the Operation Market Garden, missed the Battle of the Bulge completely, and ended up in the episode. I think it was like 4 months between when he was gone, and so he missed, of course, the Battle of the Bulge and then the assault at Foy.
Thank God for small favors, huh?
Yeah, well, I don't know that he. I mean, maybe he thought. I mean, and this was something that was interesting. Obviously, looking into the background. And again, this will be something that you get into, but it wasn't entirely his fault. It's the military did, lose some of his paperwork as it often does. And, but yeah, he did not. I mean, it was really interesting that he saw these guys from before the Battle of the Bulge to afterwards. And this is a situation where you'll actually see somebody say before deployment, after deployment. So for a lot of these guys that made it through the winter, they were completely changed, and Webster knew them before and saw them after, compared to Lieutenant Jones, who's only seeing them after. So it was really interesting in the episode where you had both of these points of view.
Right. Here's the thing: is something that I want to put out there just before we even get into it, because I don't think we'll have an opportunity to when it brings up. But that cold-hearted effect that Easy Company gives Webster when he shows up, knowing that he completely missed the Battle of the Bulge, and the bringing up of well, Bill Garnier made it back to the company and Popeye made it back to the company. You talk about where David Webster came from, the hoity-toity high society or more of a rules-based society type upbringing. He wasn't going to move until the Army told him to move. He wasn't going to just go off and do what he needed to, do whatever he wanted to do, like a Bill Garnier would have done. Doesn't make him a bad person. It's just it's a personality trait. He's going to wait for the Army to tell him what to do, and then he's going to go do it. And Bill Garnier was going to get on a truck or a train and get out of there as soon as possible to get back to his company without the Army telling him to. I mean, they talk about Bill Garnier breaking out of the medical facility to get back, and everyone's like, well, Webster, how did Bill Garnier get back? And Webster fails to say, well, Bill Garnier got back because he broke the rules and ran off, and in any other circumstance would be in trouble if there wasn't a war going on for what he did. And when you put that into perspective, Webster was just doing what Webster was being told to do, and they lost his paperwork, and he had to wait before he got sent back to Easy Company.
Yeah, I think it's likely that it probably didn't even occur to him. It's not that he didn't want to go back and join the company. It didn't occur to him how he would do that, right, to break out and break the rules. On the other side, though, I think it's important to recognize that the guys like, Toy had come back early. It's while they were filming it, and he had his arm in the sling, and he's like, screw that, I'm getting out of the aid station, I'm coming back to the front. And so they had just recently lost, a couple of the senior leaders in the company that they had been with for years, because they were the ones that had done what Webster didn't do. And so it's one of those things, like, not only did, because if Garnier was still there and they would have had that back and forth, and then Garnier might have said, well, it was blah, blah, blah. But those guys who had done that weren't still there, and they had lost them. And so there was a lot of resentment, just like there is any resentment. Anytime that we lose anybody in combat, we want to find somebody to blame. And I think Webster was a target at that point.
Yes, definitely was. He definitely was a target. And for the sense of the storyline, it's a great part of the story because it brings up something that I'm sure you, I, Eddie, Bennett, we've all seen this kind of thing go down as this story plays out in any military unit that we've been in before. The main points of what's going on in this story. So let's get to the episode then. This episode of Band of Brothers is the one episode that diverts the most from the historical record. You'll hear Duane and I give you many dual event recaps in the show. And what that means is we'll tell you what happened on the show, and then we're going to tell you what actually happened. It's not meant to sharpshoot the writers. They do a fantastic job in the series as a whole in the telling of the events accurately, and for the sake of entertainment and keeping the story easy to follow and condensed for the time, we understand and applaud the job they did in taking artistic license while keeping the heart of the story intact. The episode opens up with Private David Webster returning to Easy in the French town of Haguenau, following a lengthy respite after being wounded in the Crossroads battle in the Netherlands. The other members of Easy, having fought in Bastogne and Foy, act coldly towards him. Resentful of his non-participation in those two key battles, their attitudes hint at Webster's long stay in the hospital and his making no effort to return quickly to rejoin the company. Webster then recognizes Tech 4 Kevin Mackin, but Mackin doesn't remember who Webster is at first sight. Webster then walks over to his old outfit, Easy Company's 1st Platoon, but Lieutenant Jack E. Foley doesn't know who Webster is, so he explains. Webster wonders where Corporal Donald B. Hubler is, his old friend, but as we mentioned in the beginning, Hubler was killed in the last episode by his own hand. Webster isn't given any answer, whether it's because they just don't want to talk about it or because they don't think Webster deserves to know what happened to Hubler is up to speculation. PFC Roy W. Cobb, my man, and Staff Sergeant Job W. Martin tell Webster to go and report to 2nd Platoon and find Tech 5 Joseph T. Joe Liebgott, Staff Sergeant Donald G. Malarkey, and Private Eugene G. Jackson on the 2nd Platoon truck. So basically, he gets booted from 1st Platoon, his old platoon, and gets pushed over to 2nd. So we need to kind of discuss the attitude towards Webster. Let's talk about the bonds that are built between individuals who have participated in the same suck. And you know where I'm going with this. It's there's something that happens. The Battle of Debecca Pass, the guys who were there, for me, all of us have this bond that's never gonna go away. We can be away from each other for years and years and years, and we get back together and we're just friends. And you can read about it in that book Over Your Shoulder, American Soldier by Tommy Franks, because he talks about having to put out that we all got killed in a briefing while our wives were watching. But there's that happens between people, that they experience the same horrific experience, and for those who weren't there, as lucky as they were not to have that experience, they become outsiders to us.
Yeah, that's true. But also think about maybe some of those deployments where there were no suck, and were you or are you as close to those guys on the non-suck deployments.
Yeah, no, and it seems that you may not be. Those guys
Right.
they're just random people that you know.
So it's out of my 5. I really keep in contact with guys and gals from 2 of them. My 15-month tour in Iraq, and then the closest that I have to my 12-month tour in Afghanistan, and those were both the most kinetic. I was on a MIT team. My second deployment in Afghanistan, nothing really happened. There was no challenges, and there wasn't any suck. I mean, my latrine was in the same building I slept in, so it was not a deployment really. And so I don't keep in contact with those guys. Maybe once in a while email, but I'm much more in contact with those that we have that shared stress experience. And again, Webster, although he did have some of that, he did have some legitimacy from being there on D-Day and the assault on Normandy and stuff like that. He didn't have the credentials of making it through the winter at Bastogne, and I think that was the biggest thing for him.
Yeah, and then the one thing that's very telling in this is that, and he even mentions it in the show, that he was a Toccoa man. They had held on to this. Guys who were there from the beginning. These Toccoa men had a special bond that no one else knew about. Shifty Powers, who was not a Toccoa man, was treated differently at first than everyone else, and at this point is one of the guys. And Webster is kind of thrown to the side, and so the suck that happened in Bastogne did take its toll emotionally on these guys and create a new bond that was different from just being a guy that was there from the very beginning.
Well, sure, but then also you think about he wasn't an easy company Toccoa man, right?
But for the show, for the show's sake, he was. They never make the distinction that he came from Fox Company. So even in the show, they're bypassing that thing. But you're right, he wasn't a easy company guy. He wasn't under. He never served under Sobel. Our guy that we have talked about, so you and me especially. Although you'll see, we've got an entire episode on Sobel, and believe it or not, I take the side that you probably believe about Sobel, that he was much more effective of a leader for Easy Company than credit given to him, as does Dale Dye, as you'll hear when he talks about it. He never suffered under Sobel, so he didn't have that.
And that's another example of the shared suck. And so the Easy Company at Toccoa had the shared suck of Sobel, and likely, I believe, as we've talked about, that that is what made them more effective when they came out of it than maybe some of the other companies in the battalion or in the regiment. So, and even though, I mean, Webster is in a unique position to be part of the team and yet an outsider. And ultimately, that's what Webster wants. That's his role. This is a guy who easily, and even in the episode that they see that, he communicates easily with the officers. He's of that sort of, Nixon was from Yale. He was from Harvard. He has that easy communication. And as I was watching the episode, I think of Rudyard Kipling, if you can, talk with kings and keep your head about you. He was a guy that was comfortable, probably more comfortable talking to officers than he probably was to the enlisted guys. But he specifically chose to be in that role of observer and chronicler because that's what he wanted to do. And I saw that a lot in the episode. And again, as your boy Cobb will talk about that later, if you go back and you watch the show after you listen to this and just see how much Webster watches and evaluates and just sort of observes. And then at strategic points, he interjects himself, but in a calculated way and not in an impulsive and rash way.
I would also challenge everyone to watch it, and you'll see about it when we talk about this, but Webster is also very, very good at building bridges between him and other people. Liebgott specifically, who becomes maybe Webster's best friend at the end of the war. And I know that's jumping forward a little bit, but Liebgott and Webster become very, very close. Very close. And you see that bond built in this episode, and it's not built by accident. It is built specifically by Webster's attempts to build this bond between him and Liebgott. That just goes to show his intelligence and his ability to read people and his ability to understand what people want and their drives and their desires, and to, I mean, this guy is, if I didn't know any better, if you opened up his rucksack, you'd find a copy of Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, probably sitting inside his book, because he actually probably read that book, because every single thing that Dale Carnegie talks about in that book, Webster does with zeal and very professionally in this episode alone.
Well, yeah, but the thing is he doesn't use it to get out of stuff. He doesn't use it in order to make his own self. He's probably the guy that could have been sitting in the orderly room, up at regiment or something. He could have talked his way into an easier assignment. And again, I think it's probably something that might not have occurred to him because I believe he saw himself as a chronicler, and I think that he's even said this, that he was a chronicler of the war.
Yes.
And he wanted to have the most common experience possible. And so he uses you can call it manipulation, but he uses the manipulation, he uses his powers for good, not evil,
yes.
I guess,
yes.
to speak. So.
I agree. When he gets over to the 2nd platoon truck, Liebgott says that Malarkey is going to be promoted to 2nd lieutenant, but he means First Sergeant Carwood Lipton. And whether or not he means it or if he's setting up Webster to look like an asshole, we never get that specifically. But to me, every time I've seen the episode, pre and post combat deployment myself, I see it as he's fucking with him. I see it as he's just really messing with him. And so that sets up fairly well for a scene later on where he gets the look from Lieutenant Jones after he shows his ass. A pretty good, funny, lighthearted portion of the show. Webster's setting himself on the truck, and Liebgott thinks Webster loved the hospital because the 101st Airborne Division left Holland 4 months ago. That's he makes a statement. Hey, you must have loved that hospital because it's been 4 months since we've seen you, and a lot's happened in that 4 months. Webster says he was at the replacement depot, and Liebgott says that he surely tried to help them at Bastogne, which Webster doesn't know how he possibly could have done that. Liebgott says that Popeye Wynn found a way out of the hospital, and that's Sergeant Bill Garnier. Yeah, where is Garnier? Is he still in your platoon? Webster asks. No, Jackson answers. He got hit. The truck stops, and they've arrived at Hagenau, and Jackson explains to Webster that Garnier's foot was blown off at Foy. We talked about the real reason why Webster missed Bastogne was because of the loss of his paperwork. So Webster gets sent over. Martin, you can see Sergeant Martin really isn't too hip on Webster at the moment. And I don't think it's Sergeant Martin being a dick. I just think it's Sergeant Martin being like, look, man, you got to let the command decide where you're going to go. So why don't you go over and link up with command over at the head shed. And he goes over to the head shed, and he's sent over there with a new character to the Band of Brothers story. Officer played by Colin Hanks, who is Tom Hanks' son, Lieutenant Henry Jones. Duane, talk to us about Lieutenant Henry Jones.
So this guy was pretty cool. He's, this is really the only episode that he's in. He comes in and he goes out, and looked up a little bit more about him. So he graduated West Point, and he wanted to be in the paratroopers. So he went through training at Benning. But then they sent him to Camp McCall for glider training. And so he kept, and basically what I got from him was he wanted to get over to the fight sooner rather than later, but the Army kept delaying and delaying and delaying. So he showed up in Hagenau, paratroop qualified and glider qualified. And now he's in the company, clean shaven, fresh uniform, and everything.
He's a young looking guy, huh?
Yeah.
Not only did he graduate from West Point, but did you notice the day that he graduated from West Point?
Yeah, that was D-Day. I think that, and it reminded me of the story that you were in selection on 9/11, right?
Yeah.
It's those dates that happen, and things make a decision, or you make decisions based on those critical dates. And so I could see that, that was a huge day, likely a huge day at West Point, overshadowed by the news. And all of those officers of that class probably assumed that they were going to be going overseas. Again, some of them probably tried to take assignments that kept them from the front. But Jones seemed to be a guy that was sort of rearing at the leash to kind of get forward. Volunteered again to be a paratrooper because he wanted to be, the best of the best of the best, sir. And I think that he was very frustrated in getting overseas and then finding that this is actually the last combat, specific combat that the company sees. So it's sort of his last hurrah. But also it's an example of, I think, the military's, especially the mainstream military's job to kind of put people in to get experience a little bit. I mean, I think, and at the end of the show, he's going up to regiment, right? They want him up there on staff. That's all they did. They wanted him to go down, get his knees dirty a little bit, have a little bit of a war story, and then he was going to get wrapped up into the good old boy club and stars in his eyes and a great career ahead of him. And so it's and again in the episode he conducts himself pretty well. But I think that he was just sent down just to be able to get a little bit of dirt on his shoes, and then they were going to put him on the fast track.
Now it brings up something that I've been looking forward to talking about. We have a thing in the military, and as both of us being enlisted guys, we both know about this. The thought process of West Point officers as opposed to every other officer. I love this episode because this episode brings to mind my entire opinion about it. This guy's a good officer. He does a very good job of knowing his role, identifying where he fits in place inside the unit, giving the NCOs the time they need to be in charge. On the mission, he really does look towards Sergeant Martin for the focus that he needs to get the mission done. And we know that there is a kind of a thing in the military about West Point officers and what how they fit in and whether or not they're arrogant and all this other stuff. And I've always not found that. I found West Point officers to be very professional, very smart, some of the best officers I've ever run into. And yes, there's individuals out there who are jerk offs as compared to other ones, but I just want to put it out there that I never fell into the whole mindset of West Point officers being any different than any other officer I ran into. I would actually say that they actually may come in having a little bit more of a mindset for the way I think an officer should be coming out of college than some of the other officers. What do you think?
No, I agree, but I think there was a shift at some point, maybe in my observation. I don't know if it was because by the time that I started to grow up in the ranks and interact more with West Pointers, but in the mid to late 90s, I started to see a shift in attitudes from sort of the longstanding West Pointers, the ring knockers and that sort of club, to probably some of the best officers I served with were graduates of West Point, men and women, and they were humble in my opinion. My MIT team commander, my second tour in Afghanistan, he was a West Pointer, and he was a great guy. Very, like you said, very disciplined, very effective. He was a Ranger. He was second ACR. The one thing that he always said was they didn't get the typical college experience.
No, they did not.
See,
no, they did
I
not.
was on a MIT team, and there was he was a major, and there were probably 6 or 7 3 or 4 captains and 3 or 4 E7s, and we used to sit around and talk about how the captains who had gone through ROTC or they went to college and then went to OBC or something like that, that of course they had the typical college experience, the parties and the frat houses or whatever, where it was not like that for the West Pointers. Even in the senior year, it was very regimented, and they feel like they lost out on what a typical college experience would be. So that, of course, would make them have a different mindset than maybe some of the other officers. And I think that's true of all graduates of all the service academies. It's just it's a different type of situation. Not only that, it's hard. And so they saw people that didn't make it through, right? They saw people that fell out or quit or didn't come back. And so it was as much getting the ring and graduating from West Point was as much a war of attrition. It's my boss now, he's a West Pointer. He said, he's going through the gauntlet. And once you emerge through the gauntlet, you're no longer the same person that you were before. The challenge is when you make it through hell, not hell, whatever you call it, of West Point, that doesn't really compare to a winter at Bastogne.
No, it sure doesn't. It sure doesn't. But I will say that going through 4 years of basic training, which is what I think some of those West Point kids go through.
Yeah.
It's 4 years of basic training with really high level and high expectations of academic excellence. It does make for a different perspective than someone who's gone through University of West Virginia, spent 4 years at the #1 party school in the United States, ROTC or not. So it does make for a different mentality. So we're at the head shed, and we see First Sergeant Lipton is massively sick. Lieutenant Spears and First Sergeant Lipton are starting to have their dynamic build. This is one thing that we're not going to get too much into Lieutenant Spears in this episode. We already have, but you start seeing more of the side of Lieutenant Spears that you don't see in the other episodes in this episode, where his interaction between him and the NCOs. Lieutenant Spears is always someone that's been a bit of an enigma in the show with all the stories about him, but his interaction with First Sergeant Compton, you see that, or First Sergeant Lipton, you see that he really does care about his men, to the point where multiple times in the show he tells Jones, "You're not getting on that patrol." So the patrol is planned for the night. A patrol is planned for the evening. The platoon will cross a nearby river to capture a German soldier for intelligence. And I've always found this to be weird, that they just send a patrol out to capture someone to bring back for intelligence. And I don't know, believe me, we are well aware that we were not there during World War II and do not have the insight as to how they ran operations back then. But we generally don't do this nowadays. Intelligence is something that's built from going out and building sources and all that kind of thing. And if you capture somebody on the battlefield, you can battlefield interrogate, send them back to guys like me, and we would interrogate them a little bit differently and enhanced or not. And is it odd to you? Do you find this as odd as I do, this method of gaining intelligence by sending a patrol out just to capture an individual?
The reason I laughed was I thought you were saying that we don't send people out on stupid, pointless patrols anymore.
No, we do that all the time. We do that all the time.
That is, I mean, and it's different reasons. You think about if you listen back to some of Eddie's Black Sunday episodes where they're talking about, securing polling stations for the Iraqi election. One of our first, if I recall correctly, my first contact in Afghanistan was we had just come back from our mission and were spun back around. We weren't even brought all the way back to main camp. We were given a frago, spun back around to escort 2 pickup trucks full of tables and polling booths. Not even the ballots or anything else, but we had to take these 2 pickup trucks, and we had like 12 gun trucks to escort 2 pickup trucks back up to a remote polling place. And it was pointless. It's like, can a Chinook pick this stuff? And so this is one of the things where we're like, really? I mean, I really understood how these guys felt, saying, look, we're almost done here. Do we really have to do this? For us, because once we went up on, we escorted up Route Stetson, and we stirred Hornets' Nest, and we usually had to let it cool down for a couple days before we went back up there. No, we had a frago to take 2 pickup trucks full of crap back up there less than 12 hours. And so these are the kind of things that happen all the time, and it's necessary, and we do it, and we don't like it. So I don't. Then it was, getting prisoners. I think Eddie was talking about one of his episodes. It was for a photo op for like Texas A&M or something like that. We get sent out into sector for really bad reasons, for really asinine reasons, and it still happens.
No, it does, and that's one of the things that really appeals this episode to a lot of people, is that whole idea of what is the point of this mission? It doesn't have an end state that seems to be worthy of it. They're getting ready to cross into Germany. The war is all but over. The Germans are on their last legs, and here we are being sent across the river when we just got here, getting sent across the river into what is basically a stalemate. It looks like you've got both front ends of the lines with a river in between them, and they're just staring at each other, and both sides want it to be over at this point. And you want us to go over there and stir up some shit. Like you said, stir up the Hornet's Nest, get them all fired up and pissed off. Well, Webster begins to show diplomatic skills. He convinces both Captain Winters and Captain Spears to allow the combat inexperienced Lieutenant Jones join the patrol, and the burned out Sergeant Malarkey to be replaced when he hears that it's Malarkey's unit that's going to be placed on this. And this jumps forward a little bit, but I just want to get it out of the way that both Jones and Webster are both put on this. Now, they didn't seem to have an issue with Webster being on the patrol at all up front, but they really did have a problem with sending Jones out there. Both Spears and Winters, both at first, multiple times, were like, no to Jones. Do you think that's And then this is honest guy question: do you think that has to do with the West Point versus other officer thing, or is that just a brand new officer being looked after and made sure that he doesn't get sent out to die in some stupid mission?
No, actually, I don't think it's either of those. I don't think at that point Winters really gave much of a crap about West Point, not West Point. You know, I think he was really beyond that stuff. I think it's more what you alluded to earlier is Spears didn't want an inexperienced leader putting his men in danger. They recognized how close they were to the tripwire, basically. And I think it was and sure, it might have been, look, I don't even know you, because how many times when you first show up to a unit, you know, when you reported to a new team, or, you know, I came to a new company, people are going to look at you sideways and, you know, look at all the stuff in your uniform and size you up. They don't even know this guy.
Right.
They don't even know his first name. And he's already asking to go out on patrol. And I can imagine they would say, if you really knew what it was like there, hero, you wouldn't be begging.
Yeah,
right.
True
And
story.
so it's one of those things, I think, that they were probably trying to protect the men. And they wanted experienced patrol leadership, and they hadn't had a chance to evaluate him.
Well, speaking about that, let's talk a little bit about Malarkey. He has a really good, important part in this episode, and I think it begins in the episode before when you see Malarkey is really affected by what happens to Compton. There's that scene where he's trying to read the letter for him in the tent after Compton has his breakdown, after Toy and Garnier both lose legs, and Malarkey he's a very good character in this whole series. The guy who he starts to see you see the effects of combat on somebody with Malarkey. Way back in episode 3, he's the guy that when they get back to England, shows up and has to pick up all the laundry of the guys that died, and he doesn't want to tell the woman who's saying, "Hey, do you know anything about this guy? Do you know anything?" He doesn't want to tell her that, well, these guys are dead, so he just pays for everyone's laundry. You see him exposed to what happens with Compton and Garnier and Toy, and that effect to where Lipton brings him Hubler's gun and says, "Here, I want you to send this home to your kid brother." And then in this episode, he specifically a lot of the online websites that talk about this show use all the different tropey words, and they call it the beard of woe that he's grown. So he's got this beard in this episode, and they call it the beard of woe because you can see he's clean shaven throughout most of the show, and here he's got this beard, and you can see the shower scene is just so indicative of a man who is just at the end of his rope. Talk about a little bit about what you see with Malarkey's character and how things are just gotten to the end for him. He's really worn out and affected by everything he's seen.
Well, and I think it goes to, what you and I have experienced and what we see with veterans that we work with is you can only take so much physically, emotionally, psychologically before it starts to take a toll on you. I was thinking earlier this morning, it's been just past 8 years, going on 9 years since we lost Sergeant Wolf, and it still bugs me. This is 2 months after, 2.5 months after he lost 3 of his best friends, 2 to the blast and then Buck Compton. He was his platoon leader, right? I mean, I remember how close I was to my platoon leader, your team commander, and so just as you had mentioned how Spears and Lipton started building that bond, the command team of any element starts to build a bond. And if I were to lose my lieutenant, anybody, it would affect any of us. And so that's one of the things, though, that as you get closer and everybody's trying to be more careful and everybody's trying to not, I think they even talk about at the beginning of the episode, walk lightly. He just doesn't give a crap anymore. It just his give a crap meter is gone. I remember a guy talking about they went to for those who are listening who may not be familiar, for us the unit's relief in place, right, where the units will relieve us and we'll switch out. That they went to an outpost for their relief in place, and one of the guys sitting there on the outpost, breaks open a Kim Light, starts drinking it. And it's like, okay, are you doing it to mess with the new guys? But either way, why would you do that?
Right.
And then later on, the guy, throws up, fluorescent green. I mean, it's like, how touched in the head do you have to be to do stuff like, even if you are trying to mess with the new guys, it's just something that the toll wears down on people psychologically. And you're right, the beard of woe, but it just shows that he stopped caring. Not that he stopped caring about his men, but it's a matter of caring too much until, whether compassion, fatigue, or whatever. But yeah, the shower scene just shows how broken down he really is. Even before the Battle of the Bulge, if somebody would have come in and said, hey, Malarkey, tap out, I'm going to take your role on this patrol, he says, screw that, I'm not going to do that. No, this time he was like, yes, sir. That was
going to be where I went with it, is that you have these guys that you're not stopping them from doing their job. Malarkey, for all of for Scott Grimes' portrayal of him as kind of a jokey kind of guy, he was one of the guys you can count on. He was going to get the job done. He was a warrior and a killer, and here he wasn't. Here he was just like, no, man, I just can't. So there's always the misconception, was Webster kissing ass, sucking up by doing everything? That they portray it as a very shallow way to get Malarkey out to try to rebuild the bridge, but I think it's more than that. I think Webster cares about the guys in Easy Company, and he sees that these guys are broke and they're wore down, and he gets there, and the only one, and this is an interesting part, the only guy that welcomes him with open arms is Sergeant Keene. Sergeant Keene, who's not a part of the show in any respects, but they're moving over to link up with their new companies, Lieutenant Jones and hey, son, that's my son just walked in. They're walking over to link up with their new platoon, and Sergeant Keene is stealing potatoes. And Sergeant Keene
it's not stealing. I mean,
he's scored some
constructive
potatoes.
Acquisition.
Yeah, he's scored some potatoes, and he's all excited about it. He goes, "Oh, hey Webster, buddy, look, I scored some potatoes." And Webster's like, "Okay, potatoes, great." He's like, "Oh, where do we get?" And they're all dodging artillery fire that's coming in on the streets, and he makes it over to this company, and to see all these guys just completely, for lack of a better term, they're just broken. And I think that what he does is it's an act of compassion for his brothers. These guys, they need a break. Let's get Liebgott off this mission. He doesn't need to be on there to be an interpreter. I'll be the interpreter. Martin obviously seems to still be the cold-hearted Martin that I always remember. Why don't we get Malarkey and his company off this, and we'll put Martin in charge? And he's seeing things from the point of view of not having – he's seeing them as they are. He's seeing the new guys – that are replaced these old people that he knows. And everyone's like, well, he kind of fucked Sergeant Martin. But no, he sees that Sergeant Martin is still holding on a little bit to what Martin was. He can handle this situation where maybe Malarkey can't.
Well, see, I don't know if I think Martin being put on the patrol was a piece of Webster's unintended consequences. I don't think he thought that far forward. I thought that he was probably thinking that they would let Jones go be in charge, so to speak. And then a couple of the E5s, would have sort of tagged him along. I don't think he planned on Martin being tagged with this, and I think he had that kind of oh crap moment whenever he realized
it's my favorite part of the whole episode when Martin gives him that look,
staring him down. But this is, I think, another thing to Webster's character, and get back to his motivations in a minute. I think when Martin selects him for the assault team, Webster takes it. He's like, okay, if that's what it takes, if that's the burden that I have to bear, then I'm okay with that piece. I think, like you said, it was compassion or concern. Think about if just families, our families. After we're gone for a year, we come back and we're physically changed. Or think about after you haven't seen somebody for a long time and they've grown a beard, or they had a beard and they shaved it, or that they've lost a couple pounds every other week, but you haven't seen them in 6 months, and all of a sudden they're 25 pounds lighter, and you're like, holy crap. To them, it's a gradual change, but to somebody that has gone and then come back after that period of time, it's like night and day. And the change is so stark to someone who hasn't been there through the progression. I think that's what Webster is looking at. He's seeing this stark change. And then he's deciding, again, very strategically, I'm going to intersect at this point. I'm going to intersect at that point. And I think, again, he was intelligent enough to know that the guys were screwing with him. Like you said, that I really do think when they were trying to set him up for Malarkey, being promoted to lieutenant, because they were all snickering in the background.
Yeah.
He when they said, yeah, we'll keep it quiet that you told us who's going to be on patrol, and then they dimed him out in a heartbeat.
Oh, they dime him out in a second.
Well, yeah, but he was like, okay, fuckers, right? But he just kind of takes it, right?
Yeah.
And he doesn't like it. He doesn't like being put in this situation. You can tell that. And I think for him, it's a lot more uncomfortable because he's an observer, but now he has to be an actor within what he's observing. And so that little piece is uncomfortable for him. But I think that really the choice to try to get Malarkey out and Jones on is because he understands where Jones is coming from, the need to be part of the team or something like that. And so he's trying to help out as many people as possible. And then when it backfires on him and it gets to Martin, he's like, okay, so be it.
So they get over and all this stuff goes down, and then they're going to get ready to go on this mission. And then they take another shelling outside. And the one guy that was opened up to, a positive, welcome back Webster, Sergeant Keene, is killed outside. And Sergeant Christensen, played by Michael Fassbender, is a big part of this scene because he was friends with Keene. But you lose this guy that I think a lot is missed in the episode to the impact of that on the men of Easy Company, where Webster talks about it. Sergeant Keene died for a pack of potatoes. But this guy was a Toccoa man. This is someone they knew for a long time, who, on top of everything else that's going on, where they think they're towards the end of it, they're getting showers, they're living in a building that's got heat, and this guy dies, and it's such a sad. I don't think they missed it. The producers and the writers, I don't think they missed the importance of Sergeant Keene getting killed, but I think that the show doesn't see it as much as I see it when I see the impact of this guy who had made it through everything. Made it through D-Day, made it through Market Garden, made it through the Battle of the Bulge, and he dies in the streets of Haguenau because he was running back to get more potatoes. And it's sad. It's a sad scene, I think.
It is a sad scene, but it also, I think, shows the development of Webster into cynicism. I mean, that was even when I rewatched it, and this is an episode that does bear rewatching. I mean, I think I saw one time where it doesn't get a lot of press because it's between two really great episodes, or two of some of the most pivotal episodes when they leave Bastogne and then when Why We Fight. But excuse me. But it shows how cynical Webster already is and how cynical he is going to start becoming even more. Because as everybody leaves, as Sergeant Keene is there, and then the two new guys, so to speak, Jones and Webster. So Lieutenant Jones asks Webster, well, did you know him well? No, not really. And he turns around and walks away. And it's this sort of hardening, of the emotion, because you can't. They already know, hey, we're going on this patrol that night. I can't spend time to mourn this guy. Even more to the fact that I wasn't there for Hubler. And again, this is not written into either the book or the show, but you and I both know that this likely was going through Webster's mind. Well, what if I would have been in Bastogne? Would Hubler still be alive? Would I be the one that says, dude, clear your weapon before you stick it in your pants? Things like that. And so this shows the progression of Webster's cynicism as he goes along, his disenchantment, which then shows even more in the next episode.
Oh yeah, definitely in the next episode, and we will talk about that when Andrew McDowell's on. We have spoiler alert. I've already recorded that episode, and there is definitely a talk about Webster's breakdown on the backs of the trucks going into the next film or next town. So the patrol is all set up. Here's something, guys, before we go into the actual patrol itself, I've got to say something that kind of really, you have to understand, this doesn't negate everything me and Duane have been saying about this, because the episode has to be standing on its own. But Jones and Webster didn't actually go on the patrol in real life.
Yeah, we just made it all that.
All this stuff that we're talking about is only for the characters in the show as they happened in the show, because in real life, Webster and Jones never make it onto the crossing of the patrol. They are put into the patrol as far or near side security on the riverbank. They're allowed to participate in that, but they never actually cross the river as it's shown. And if you think about it, when you watch the episode during the river crossing in the inflatable boats, when they get to the other side, everything that's important that happens on the other side of the river doesn't include Webster or Lieutenant Jones at all. It's Martin and the rest of the guys. So the show does a good job of, although it shows them being on the mission, Martin is in charge. Everything that happens on the far side during the patrol itself doesn't really include Webster or Jones. So they don't, even though they take artistic license with pushing people over on the other side of the river who weren't there, they don't have them do anything important over there that takes away from what actually happened. Do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, and again, this is, and I hope that as everybody goes through and listening to Jeff's shows, go back and watch the show again with new eyes. But over there by the outpost, there's only like 8 guys. You have the 2 teams that are on security, and then like 5 guys that go into the 4 or 5 guys that go into the house. And so even there, of the 15 guys, obviously there were some that were held back. And then, as you said, Jones, quote unquote, is put on security, and Webster's place is really as interpreter, and he sets the charge. But that likely could have happened. I forget who they said the interpreter was, But yeah, I think that this was
Forrest Guff was the actual interpreter on the mission.
Well, there you go. But I think this was as critical as Webster was to Ambrose's book, and he was a lot of the source material. And this was a way to kind of be able to tell this story through one of the critical aspects. I mean, this is one of the weirdest things I think with Webster was he wasn't a very critical part to any of the stories, but he was that background character writing everything down. So he was sort of the narrator that you never see. And from what I understand, Ambrose held him in very high esteem, both as a writer and as a war chronicler. So I think that this was sort of the like you said, the artistic license that gave the team the ability to highlight Webster's contribution to the overall work.
Right, and I equate this a lot with the writers of the show to the episode Bastogne with Doc Rowe. Both of these incidents and things that are on these episodes are not major parts of his book. The Doc Rowe episode itself is completely made up for the show. It doesn't exist in Ambrose's book at all. They mention Doc Rowe, but they do not give him the time that the episode Bastogne does. And this is also, Webster, although a big part of it, doesn't take a first-person seat in Ambrose's book at all. And I think this was done, like you said, to pay homage to the fact that Webster was a source material for much of Ambrose's research into writing this book. And so therefore, getting an episode put in this series in a 10-part episod, getting an entire episode focused on you is really it's something that honors you as an individual, which is why Doc Rowe was so why it's such a well received episode, even though him and the female that was in that episode were both not parts of the book at all. Almost, it just says a lot about what the writers, the producers, and everything thought about these individuals, and that they made it into the show. So they get over to the other side of the river. There is a capsizing of one of the inflatable boats on the way over there. It's kind of a passing information. I don't think anything happens to any of those guys. They just can't make it across the river. They have to stick on the other side. They get over there, and they're moving towards the place where they know the Germans are staying in the one house. And then we have Private Jackson. Now, I want to bring this up just because every time I watch this, when my own son, who knows nothing about warfare but what he learns on video games, and although he's very good tactically at all them video games, when he recognizes that this guy threw not a flashbang, but threw a frag grenade and immediately followed the frag grenade into the room. Even my son is yelling, "Oh, what are you doing?" as it's happening, as they're happening. So Private Jackson, what do you think? Because he's not inexperienced. He was a younger guy, but he was not an inexperienced combat veteran. I think he was a byproduct of being stuck in Bastogne, not doing active combat operations, and he just got really excited about actually doing an offensive operation for once, and just found himself following a frag grenade into a room that he threw himself. That was what really got me about this Private Jackson incident. So Private Jackson throws a frag grenade in through the window into a room and immediately runs up the stairs as Martin's yelling at him to stop into the room right on top of his own frag grenade.
Well, I think it's a danger in leaders making the assumption that that people they believe in are skilled. Yes, Jackson. I think he was a replacement for one of the early. I remember him coming in, as one of the replacements, and in the episode replacements, I think.
Yes.
And he made it. He was probably one of the last group of those replacements still to be remaining. He made it through Bastogne. It's probably what earned him Martin's respect to have him on the assault team, and so to speak. And so Martin says, well, this guy made it through Bastogne. He should be skilled, but he's not skilled in close quarters combat. That's the issue. Is Bastogne was a much different fight. It's the difference in my experience. Much of the challenge for my Iraq deployment was due to indirect fire. A lot of the patrols we had were at night, and it was during curfew, and there wasn't a lot of action on the roads, but we were getting bombed literally daily. Like, you could set your watch by it. And that's a very different type of experience. You can't shoot back. You don't have any direct action that you have. You basically just sit there and take it and then figure out what to do next. And so, yes, Jackson had a trial by fire, but it was a different trial by fire. It was basically an endurance trial. And he probably he definitely shouldn't have been the lead man on this patrol, and arguably probably should not even have been on the assault team.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. And it has a lot to do with sand tables and rehearsals being a very, very important part of combat operations, no matter the experience level that you have.
Right.
And NCOs, and at risk of sounding arrogant, professional NCOs like us know that. I don't give a shit if you've graduated Ranger School, or I don't care if you've went to SOTIC or OTC. We're gonna dry run this. We're going to do rehearsals because everyone needs to know exactly what they're supposed to do. And if they don't know what they're supposed to do, then whatever bad stuff can happen will happen, because it's going to come up anyway. Murphy's always going to be out there.
Martin telling Jackson, don't follow your grenade in the door, should have happened about 6 hours earlier, and then it would have been,
right.
And that's really it. I mean, that was at the time where he was trying to keep it from happening. It was already too late. The heat of battle and adrenaline and everything else. And again, not to say, I mean, it's, and we're sitting here, 70 years or something, removed, and making the choices. But yeah, it's something that had Martin taken a step back and said, okay, Jackson, when you go in, this is what you're going to, because the only briefing that we saw was, and now that I think about it, Winters was about to start going through that during the briefing at 1700, and Martin was like, yeah, okay, you guys got it. That big hand wave, okay, you guys got it. That's the dangerous spot.
Yeah, that's something that I think is not done without intent. I mean, that's there to show that unfortunately Jackson may have died because of a lack of paying attention to detail and doing all the things. There's never let me see if I can put this right way. There's never a patrol that is just a random patrol. Every patrol has to be looked at as if it's going to be because it's all that you hear, all the best stories, all the best combat stories, this was just a standard daily thing that we were just going to do.
Day like any other day.
Day like any other day. Yeah, that's the thing. It's a day like any other day. Well, guys, there's never a day like any other day. Each day is new and comes with its own challenges. And if you don't prepare yourself for the unexpected, you get Jackson running into his own frag grenade and really killing himself in all aspects, because they police up their one prisoner. They have the charge set in place. They leave a wounded German on the side of the river, because they had two, and one of them is too wounded to keep dragging back. There's three. Okay, so they have three.
Yeah, they brought two back, and they had one because the two wounded guys were carrying the third. Then they left the third wounded guy.
Right, and they left him thinking he was going to die. They thought he was going to die, and so they leave him on the banks, and they bring back the guys to the CP, and you have that scene where you have the young pack clerk who was allowed to go on the mission as a attaboy. Again, another mistake by very few mistakes done by Winters and all them. This is one of them, I think. They allow guys. Well, I really want to go out and do a mission. Okay, here you go, buddy. Go out and do this mission. and he gets exposed to things he hasn't been exposed to before. And what does he do? He tries to fucking kill one of the German soldiers after Jackson dies because he thinks that Jackson died because of the German soldier. Now, Jackson died because of Jackson. And everyone else seems to get that, except for this young pack clerk guy who tries to go after the German, and he has to get dragged off by everybody because he wants to kill this guy. And it shows that even at the combat experience level that everyone in Easy Company has, they're still making mistakes. And there's still room to make mistakes, especially at this late hour. And this is when the big mistakes happen. So they get back. Everything is Jackson dies. There's no way of it seems like they made it look like he walked into a Willie P grenade too. It looks like the burns that were on him were fairly worse than what you would expect from a frag grenade. Though I don't see why, and I have found no evidence that they actually used Willie Pete on direct action missions. I don't see why they would do that, because anyone that ran into that house after a Willie Pete grenade would go off. White phosphorus, for those of you who don't know, white phosphorus, guys, was something that was used in the military, even up until me and Duane were in for a couple years. It's not there anymore. They do not use it anymore, but this was a gas that was white phosphorus metal based, and white phosphorus, when it burns, it sticks to everything. And it will burn you bad, and water poured on it will just make it worse. Do you have anything you want to talk about white phosphorus? The beauty of that?
No,
weapon?
I don't. It's the destructive power. They now we use thermite grenades to decimate equipment. But no, going back to Jackson, I think there was fire because the medic doc looked into his mouth. I mean, I think, and there probably were burns internally in his throat because he didn't look at the side of his face. He was looking in his mouth, and he probably saw something in there. So it could have been, kerosene or something else that was in the outpost. But yeah, I think there were burns. There were more burns than frag that were his injuries.
Well, all that happens, and then we have a little bit of a flash forward to everyone sitting around the platoon CP being affected by what just happened. And in walks my favorite character. So in staggers Cobb. Now, you guys have heard me talk about Cobb before, and look, guys, I fucking hate this dude. I hate this guy. I watched this show so I could watch him and hate him. I hate him in the show Replacements, the way he treats the new guys. Loved the way that Randleman handles him in Replacements. And in this episode, he really comes to exactly what I think of him. He's drunk. He starts going after Webster and the lieutenant. And the lieutenant does a fucking great job of putting him in his place. But what I want to say about Cobb as a character, as much as he's just a turd, is that everybody that's ever served the military has run into Cobb. And I don't mean Cobb the individual. I mean the personality that Cobb is and what he represents in the show. He represents this guy who is a badge protector. I got mine. I'm better than you. Nothing you can do is good enough. I think I'm the guy that can say anything I want to say and give everybody shit. I mean, just a real toilet bowl of a personality. Before I rant and rave about him, maybe I can get. What do you think? What do you think about Cobb, Duane?
Well, yes, I think Cobb is a perfect example of what I've said before, and not all veterans are heroes, right? We're not all really great people. Just serving in combat doesn't make us wonderful individuals.
No.
He's drunk. He's a jerk. He's the one that kind of waves Webster off at the beginning and says, "Get your butt over to 2nd Platoon" and things like that. What I'm not sure that you know is that Cobb was a combat veteran before he went to Toccoa. He was in North Africa and then joined the paratroopers before he went into D-Day. And so, not to make any excuses for his character or anything like that, but he's a guy that has been through just a little bit more than some of the other guys. But obviously he's a guy that, having been in the service that long, was never promoted to NCO, right? If you're a Toccoa guy, you see Garnier and Malarkey and they're E7s, right? By this time, where Cobb was that perpetual E4 that he's like, "I'm the highest ranking E4 in the battalion."
Oh, I love those guys. I love those guys.
We had a guy that was like, "I'm the best gunner in this entire brigade." Yeah, because you've been an E4 for 10 years, right, and nobody will let you do anything else.
Right. Yeah. It's not because you're so good at being a gunner. I mean, shit, I could teach a monkey to shoot a gun.
Right. It's just that you've spent the last 8 years sitting behind a 50 cal, so you might as well learn something through sustained effort. And so I think that, yeah, Cobb is this perpetual E4. He's a bully. I mean, that's really what he is.
And that's why I don't like him.
He's a bully, but also can't hold his liquor, apparently.
No, he cannot.
And at this point, I believe they know they're going back out, right? They know that they're going back out on a patrol.
Yeah, they did mention. They mentioned that they were going back out on another patrol the next night.
Right, and so this is a good scene that again demonstrates that Webster's doing what Webster does. He's observing. He's looking at everybody else. He's probably writing his next. Well, if it were now, he'd be a blogger, right? If he were, so he's writing his next letter, probably. He's writing his next chapter. Not that I think he was writing a book at that time, but the next part when he was sitting there looking around, he was composing in his head, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And Cobb caught him looking at everybody else and wants to call him out and wants to be a bully. And Jones, I think, emerging into what he is, I mean, he probably saw it at West Point, the upperclassmen beating on the plea. I mean, Jones had seen guys like this. They're in the officer corps just like they are in the enlisted side, and so he calls them out. And then I think this was pivotal for when Martin sides with the lieutenant against Cobb. He'd been with Cobb the whole time, right? Yes. And of course he knew what kind of guy Cobb was, because it was, he was probably the one guy that they kept around to do the dirty work, and you don't get to kick my dog, but I'll kick my dog all day kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think this was a good example of how I guess Jones sort of fit in a little bit. He definitely couldn't have earned any amount of cred based off of the 4 months at Bastogne. But I think this was a turning point where they decided, okay, this guy's got some merit. He's been tested, and he passed.
Yeah, and it shows a lot of Jones's self-awareness. Like you said, he calls him out. He calls him out with a simple question. He's like, "Are you drunk, trooper?" He makes Cobb own his own condition. And Cobb, yeah, I'm drunk. And then he just looks at Martin and then doesn't say another word. He lets Martin go in there as an NCO and handle the situation, and all he did was say, "Are you drunk?" And then he looked at Martin like, now it's your turn to handle a drunk paratrooper in combat who's probably been told not to drink, who's probably not just turning into this character tonight for the first time, but is a guy who is a perpetual problem. And I've read that they toned down the entire situation. All right, so here's the reality of it. It wasn't Jones that was there for this incident. As you brought up earlier before we started the recording, Lieutenant Foley was the actual officer who was there at the moment that this event occurred, because this event did occur. Foley, who is the platoon leader for 1st Platoon, is the one who interacted with Cobb when Cobb was drunk after Cobb had accosted Webster. Martin is the NCO that got into place, and they just let it go real quick, no big deal. But there's more to the story. Well, what happens is, you pointed out to me, and I did not know, what do you see at the end of the episode in the background that points to the actual end result of Cobb's actions?
Well, it's in the episode recap as Webster, and again, Webster shows his cynicism and sort of his voiceover at the end, but it also shows that Webster's being accepted back into the, and there's a little bit more before we get into all that, but you actually see Cobb being taken away by the MPs. Everybody else is loading up in trucks, and there's 3 MPs with Cobb sitting in the back of the Jeep where he's being taken away. And so, in what I understood, the story is that he assaulted. He more specifically, he didn't just mouth off to him, but like he assaulted him. I don't know if he pulled a weapon on him or what, but he was ultimately court-martialed out of the military because of the incident there at Haguenau.
Yeah, it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Really, couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. So that was a jump forward, but let's talk about what happens. All right, so the next morning they're showing them all, and actually Cobb is there that next morning looking over in the episode. Cobb is there the next morning looking over the banks with Winters and all them, and you can hear the German soldier who was wounded. He's still yelling for help. And it shows a little bit of the compassion that's still there with Easy Company, as they do say, "God, I wish he would shut up." But I think what they don't get into is that I think they're saying that because they feel a little guilty that they left this guy that laying there wounded. They all are well aware of the long-term effects of combat on people, and it bothers them to be reminded that they're still fighting human beings, and that this guy is laying on the side of the banks of the river there, bleeding to death, so to speak. And then the charge that they left in the house finally goes off because I guess it's a little bit late for Winters. Winters is like, hey, isn't that charge supposed to go off? And then boom, it goes off. I'm going to let you go ahead and talk to us. What is it that the leadership does at the end that brings back into focus Winters and all them, and they're caring for the guys of Easy Company? They do have another mission they have to do.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in yes, things were very different in this time. You know, you have a captain leading a battalion. You have a lieutenant leading a company. It's probably a battalion of maybe like 200 guys, right? This is a company of like 20 or 30. I mean, this isn't the size military strength that we know of, but consider the same type of rank structure in the military. That Winters really puts his career on the line, and by making a decision and literally disobeying a direct order that had been reinforced. He couldn't even say, lost in translation, because Colonel Sink came down and told him specifically to do this.
Yes.
So there was no doubt in his mind. The interesting thing is Nixon, of course, and argue about sidekicks all day, that Winters, when they're over there overlooking the river and Sink comes up and talks to him, Nixon does all the talking. Nixon does the agreeing and yes, sir. And Winters does not say anything, but doesn't commit to saying, yes, sir, I'll make sure, blah, blah, blah. So I think Winters and Nixon, the both of them together, were smart enough to understand what was going to be happening.
Plausible deniability is always awesome.
Exactly. And Nixon taking a bullet for the big guy, and then Winters really ultimately, he was disobeying a direct order. And he didn't always do that. Like he did what he was told to do. You talk about in the last episode where he was about to go relieve Norman Dyke, and Colonel Sink said, "Get back here!" And but he was about to go take charge of the company. Colonel Sink orders him not to, and that's when he puts spears in. Hey brother, go out and plug the hole. And so he was a guy that, again, maybe much as you talked about Webster. Being of the kind of guy that follows the rules, this was something that Winters did very specifically and deliberately that was probably against a lot of his character, and yet he did it. And I feel as though if he would have been found out, probably Sink wouldn't have maybe gone as far as court-martialing or anything like that, but the potential was there. And I don't even think that, if those that haven't watched the show, is ultimately Winters gives the briefing and then tells them, we're going to say you went out on a patrol, but you're not actually going to go out on a patrol. So go get some sleep.
Yeah.
I
think the phrase is, I want you to get a good night's sleep. Sergeant Martin, in the morning, I want you to report to me that you went across the river and nothing happened.
Right.
It's something along those lines.
And so there's a couple of different things. I mean, number one, if he hadn't earned the loyalty of those men by then, that really locked it in. I mean, that was probably another scale in the armor of the legend of Dick Winters.
I think Recon Manor probably got him. But yeah, I agree with you. It's if you didn't have his respect yet, that definitely got it.
Right, and that's probably a story that probably 35 or 40 guys would say, I was there in the room when he said that.
Right.
It's the tale grows with the telling. But I think, but that's not why Winters did it, I believe. I mean, he did it truly to take care of his men. And Nixon, because Nixon was the one that put his signature to a false report, that would have been his career, and I think he would have done it gladly because his big brother, was there with him, and so it does show the compassion, but also the fact that leadership has to shield some troops from some of the stuff that comes down from the top. I mean, it's just. There's a point where when bad stuff rolls downhill, a good leader provides top cover so that their troops can take care of business.
I also think that if you look at it from the point of view of teaching junior officers the right thing to do, he does it with Lieutenant Jones in the room. Lieutenant Jones is there to see this incident happen, and I don't think we can let it be lost on the lesson that is given to Lieutenant Jones. Hey, sometimes you have to do what is you have to take care of the men above mission. There is a moment where you have to, mission comes first, but also you cannot get men to act outside of their own best interests if they do not believe at some level that you're looking out for theirs at some point.
And this is something that actually just occurred to me, because right after this, Jones goes to regiment. Jones very much could have
thrown
said,
him under a bus,
hey,
big time.
Hey, it really didn't happen that way. But the fact that regiment never was the wiser, Jones kept it to him, and so Jones took that lesson. Where we've probably seen leaders that wouldn't have, that they would have said. I mean, think about the next level effects of getting Winters and Nixon and Spears all relieved of command. Oh, I know the men, sir. I could be in the, you know what I mean? He could have used it to his own advantage.
Absolutely.
And ultimately chose not to. And that was a lot to Jones's character, too.
So the end of the episode, after all the other stuff, we close out with them promoting Carwood Lipton to second lieutenant, and very, very small in the corner, just the officers there, getting Lipton promoted, and him being my favorite character, and it's a great scene to watch for me, because I really do think he deserved it. Even though I do think that he went from being the first sergeant of Easy Company to being second platoon leader was a little bit of a downgrade, but that's neither here nor there. But I think he deserved getting the commission. But then right afterwards, Nixon walks outside, and Nixon says, even though you're completely disobeying direct orders of your command, and your rank does not befit your status, and they promote him right there on the spot to major. And so now, Captain Dick Winters is now Major Dick Winters. This is something that happens quite a bit in this show, with this officers being promoted to the side, and there's no real hoopla over it. Do you take anything from that as far as like the way the show doesn't really put much into the maybe was it the times? Is this the way it happened with promotion back then?
Yeah, I think that it is sort of according to the times, but I think this is a pretty amusing counterpoint to what happened at Toccoa. It's sort of similar to what Sobel said to him as well. When he said, I'm going to pin you on and you're going to be my XO or whatever, right? But it's just sort of here, I'm going to hand this to you. But again, I'm not as familiar with customs in World War II. It could have just been a matter of expediency. You heard him say, we have 15 lieutenants, since D-Day or something like that. And so it was sort of a hamster wheel, right? It's like, okay, here's yours. And then, you hear about Vietnam days of how often lieutenants change out. And so I think that it was probably just a matter of expediency, and I just don't know that it was a company formation in the European theater of operations would have been a good idea anyway.
The guys are going to get a little bit of a different end of the episode than we have for other episodes. I've been good about not spoiling alert any of the final actions of any of these guys past the episode that we're in. You didn't hear in the episode before Bill Garnier got blown up that Bill Garnier was going to get blown up. But there is something different about this episode where I think it's worthy of talking about Webster and Jones and what happens to them beyond this, because we are one episode away from the final episode of the series, or 2 episodes away from the final episode of the series, excuse me. And we are not going to talk about Webster past the next episode. Spoiler alert, Webster doesn't die. There is no way. We talked about him writing a book. We've talked about him being the source, so you kind of already knew that. But Lieutenant Jones also moves on from Easy Company at this point, ne'er to be mentioned again by Easy Company. So I think it's fair for them, because they do deserve mentioning as to what their final, what happened to these guys post-war, especially since both of them had such a tragic end, if that's not a spoiler. Let's talk about a little bit about what happens to, first of all, let's talk about what happens to Lieutenant Jones.
Okay.
We'll get to Webster since he's the focus of our show. We'll give him for last. But what happens with Lieutenant Jones? Does he ever get back to the United States?
Well, and from what I saw, he went back on some R&R. He did go back on on leave, but much like and really it's Patton, right? Patton stayed in Germany.
It sounds like that's exactly what I was thinking when I was reading. I'm like, it's
situation.
just like Patton.
Yeah. but he stays in Germany after, as part of the occupying forces, moves around a little bit. Ended up in a car accident, I think, in Heidelberg, Germany. The word is that he was well liked by a lot of his guys. He was well liked in the company. He was very popular. But then there was a surgery that needed to happen. That something happened with the car accident, and he didn't make it through the surgery.
No, 23 years old
yeah,
he was.
1947, I think, is when he died, and he died in Germany. And I think that even without the experiencing a whole battle, he probably felt like he had something to prove. But I get the sense that he was going to have a pretty good career ahead of him, and it was cut short. Like Patton, who died in an automobile accident, I think Patton would not have been a good peacetime soldier very well anyway.
Automobile accident or an attempt by communist sympathizers to silence Patton. I don't know. That's not conspiracy theory. That's something that's actually.
Isn't it interesting?
It's investigated. It has been investigated by the military whether or not Patton was assassinated or not. But so we don't want to say that. I would not go as far as to say that Patton died in an accident when it's definitely still out there that they don't know what happened on that road that night.
Yes, well, allegedly,
which
is a word that
isn't
we
it
often
funny?
use.
Isn't it funny
that this happened? But yes, whereas Patton, I don't think wouldn't have been a good peacetime general. I think that Jones would have been a pretty good peacetime officer, and if in 1947 he died when he was 23, that would have been he would have been 21 and 45, and so he was very young, being depicted by this episode.
And now we'll move on to David Kenyon Webster. So David Kenyon Webster actually becomes a fairly popular journalist after the war.
Yes, then he dies by eaten by sharks. Oh wait, did I put it out? Was that too quick?
That might have been too quick.
We wanted to build up to that?
Did we want? I don't know if we wanted to. Yeah, but 1961.
No.
What happens in 1961 to poor David Webster?
Well, and this is the thing, and I just wanted to, rip, and it wasn't that he got eaten by sharks. Again, maybe
he did get eaten by sharks.
No, it was allegedly, right? So maybe the communists took him out.
Isn't it funny that
he was lost at sea? It turns out that he actually had tried to write his memoirs, but he wasn't picked up by a publisher. And it turns out that Winters doesn't really remember him because he was such a background character. But he wrote his letters. He had his collected letters, and he tried to write his memoirs. And he wrote a couple large pieces. I think he was the New York Times, maybe it was Wall Street Journal. But he was a pretty successful journalist. And then in the years later, he became interested in sharks. And actually published a book on sharks. And it was while he was out doing more research that his boat was lost at sea. And he was pronounced dead. So he was never found. The boat was never found. And he was allegedly killed by communist sharks.
Allegedly. Isn't it funny that communist sharks could have
just
eaten David Webster?
Yeah.
No, but it is a tragic ending. And the thing is, you watch, and he did get published. He does have a book out about Easy Company. Is that correct?
Right. Ambrose, as he was doing it, Ambrose had got it published after his death, I think in the 80s or something like that.
Is that right? Is that right?
Together. Yeah. So it was, he actually didn't get published, because, and, maybe everybody wants memoirs or things like that, but it was never published during his lifetime. It was ultimately published after his death.
And that's unfortunate because it would be nice. I'm sure that his family well knows his impact on the story, and we want to let them know that I think the guy is a great character. I think he was a very impressive individual. The things that he did and the way that he handled himself is impressive, and it's definitely something that I think that a lot of people can take some history lessons from as to how you deal with people, and no matter what background you come from, you can join the grunts and still fit your way in there with them if long as you try to understand them and not talk down to them.
Yeah, I think that he's when I think about other war correspondents, J.R.R. Tolkien was in World War I think,
Dale Dye.
And so
Dale Dye, war correspondent.
And so and he resisted being promoted above private or private first class. He just stayed that working man. And only wanted to be not just, he did his duty when he had to do his duty, but it was for posterity. And like we had mentioned before, Ambrose used a lot of his manuscript and his book for his memoirs and the letters that he wrote home, because he was such a prolific chronicler of the events, that he used it for a lot of the source material for his book.
Yeah, it's a sad ending though for him. You don't get really his end. They don't really go into what happened to him after all this in the show, and that's why we bring it up now, so that we can make sure that we pay homage and honor to David Kenyon Webster and Lieutenant Jones, who again that to me is just a tragic, sad story, that he had gone on to have such a uneventful end, even though he was played by Colin Hanks, Tom Hanks' son, in the TV show.
And again, that goes with something that I've always said is just being in the military is inherently dangerous. You don't have to be in combat to, be in danger. We've been through, jump accidents, and, I've lost more. Before I went to Iraq, I must have lost, 4 or 5 different company members to different things, right? So just being in the military is inherently dangerous, and that, I think, illustrates.
So, hey, I want to thank you, Duane, for coming on.
Yeah.
Do you have any parting words you want to give to the people about your thoughts on Band of Brothers up to this point?
Not so much Band of Brothers, but I think it's worth mentioning Webster's, at least the spoken over part at the end, because it's really relevant even today. And this is what Webster at the end of the episode says. He says, "I wondered if anyone back home wondered what it cost the soldiers to win this war. In America, things were already beginning to look like peacetime. The standard of living was on the rise. Racetracks and nightclubs were booming. You couldn't get a hotel in Miami Beach. It was so crowded. How could anyone ever know of the price paid by soldiers in terror, agony, and bloodshed if they've never been to places like Normandy, Bastogne, or Haguenau, or Baghdad, or Kabul, or RC East, or Helmand," right? I mean, and so it's and these are the, I mean, if everything except we don't do racetracks much anymore, but every other word right now could be said by a voiceover in The Long Road Home,
right?
About what's, and so this is a theme that I think goes throughout a Band of Brothers. Is these were common guys that were doing, it's sons in this instance, just sons of all stripes of America doing what they do best. But even Webster said that how can anyone know what the price was if they'd never been there? And I think that's ultimately what Webster wanted was you got to know. You have to know. America has to understand that this is the price that's being paid, even though you're not going to understand perfectly.
Right. And it says a lot, the mirror image of modern society that is happening in the show at this point, because there are many people out there who forget that although we are not in the acute initial phases of a war, there's still a war going on out there, and there are still people who are being affected long term by what sacrifices they are making. God, I mean, you and I both know that we left the military when the war was still going on, and for us the war ended. The actual taking part in the war ended, even though the war may not have ended. And it's easy to forget. It's easy to forget that there are still things going on out there where people are sacrificing and dying for the way we live and what we do. And it's a good point. Yeah, Webster made a good point. It's a good point by you right now, bringing that up. So thank you.
And it's not to bash America. I love America. I don't want people to know what you and I know, right? I mean, that's sort of the reason why we do it. It's just that Webster was making that observation is maybe just be aware that you don't know and just see how that feels.
It doesn't feel good when you don't know, though. No, it doesn't. Yeah. But all right, guys. Hey, thanks for coming on this episode. And guys, next episode is going to be a very emotional one. I'm not going to lie to you. We go into some subject matter that is a little uncomfortable for some people. And to be honest, I have brought our resident Jewish member of the hosting staff on to talk about this next episode. So if you're looking for laughs and lots of jokes, we try real hard to stay blue in the beginning of the show, but it turns. I'm not going to lie to you. So be prepared. Next episode is going to be a little bit of a hard one to get through, and that actually challenges you to come listen to it because it's some very important stuff that we talk about in the next episode. But we leave Easy Company. Easy Company's leaving Haguenau, and they're moving on, and they're moving across that river into Germany and closer to finishing the war off. So 2 episodes left of the show, and want to thank Duane for coming on and imparting his opinions and his mindset, and it's always welcome on this show. I love hearing what Duane has to say, and you guys will hear him again. Maybe not on this. Well, you won't hear him again on. Oh, you might hear him again on this. We are going to bring everyone back at the end to do a follow-up episode at the end on everything that happened to everyone. I know Duane's looking at me like right now, like we are, but yeah, we are. You guys will hear all the Change Your POV hosts will be on for that one. But other than that, if you want to hear Duane, you need to go check Duane out on Headspace and Timing over in the Change Your POV podcast network. Duane, you just released a bunch of shows. Real quick, let me give you a plug, man. Go ahead and talk to us about the bunch of shows you just released, the project that you did.
Yeah, no, this is I congratulate you for taking on this series because I know the effort it takes. Because we just finished up a 13-part episode on the Veteran Mental Health Boot Camp, looking at all the different aspects of veteran mental health, looking beyond just PTSD and TBI. And in starting at episode 25, HST 25, you can look it up on the podcast aggregator of choice. It's on LinkedIn. It's on both the Change Your POV podcast, or changeyourpov.com, and veteranmentalhealth.com. Just look up boot camp, and then you'll find it there.
Oh, thank you, Duane. Good stuff. I like what I'm hearing on that show too. So it's good stuff, man. Appreciate you being on, and guys, we will check you out next week.
Lessons in Leadership, Band of Brothers is a production of Changing Hearts and Minds, hosted by Jeff Adamick on the Change Your POV podcast network. You can find other amazing shows on the network by going over to changeyourpov.com. Huge thanks goes out to all the amazing guests featured in the episodes of this series. First, our very own network hosts, Eddie Lazary and Bennett Tanton, hosts of Change Your POV podcast and Attack Friday. Duane France, host of Headspace and Timing. Andrew McDowell, host of Neophyte in the Woods. And our newest host, Benjamin Loth, hosting a show releasing soon called Branding with Benjamin. Special thanks goes out to some amazing podcast hosts who have donated their time and opinions to the series. Sam Culper of Breakers Podcast, Brad Taylor of Sofa Kings Podcast, Nick Giglio of Conspiracy Geeks Podcast, and last but certainly not least, to the man who probably had the biggest role in making Band of Brothers the series that it is today, a staple amongst military ranks and revered by all who have worn the uniform. Here's a huge salute to you, Captain Dale Dye. Owner of Warriors Inc., Dale also has a new film in the making and is planning on using veterans to be part of the cast and crew. To learn more about this and to get the links to all of the podcasts and podcast hosts mentioned, head on over to changeyourpov.com/Band of Brothers, all one word. If you like this series, share it with someone you think would like it too. Thanks for listening, and in the words of Dick Winters, I thank God for seeing me through the day of days and prayed I would make it through D+1. I also promised that if some way I could get home again, I would find a nice, peaceful town and spend the rest of my life in peace.